Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to my very first podcast. I know a lot of you probably joined the channel because of the dome-shaped underground house build, and you were following the progress on that. My podcast is going to cover some of that stuff, but it's going to be a little different. And I wanted to start out with something about the fires that are going on in LA and LA County and what people are going to have to deal with when they go to rebuild. Because I think this is something that people sort of hear that the system is broken and messed up, and they don't have really a clue or concept as to just how bad it is. So what I'm going to do is I've got a letter that I wrote to LA County supervisors that I recently sent, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase some of that. And I'm hoping that if they don't see the letter or they don't read it or it gets thrown out or whatever, maybe enough people will see this and bring this video to the attention of officials, because the system that they have in LA County is severely broken. Now, LA City has some problems as far as the building department, but it is nothing like how broken LA County is. So what I'm about to talk about is LA County and the experience I went through. With all the people who are going to need to rebuild, I think it was important that I share this story. And this is going to be a long one, but I think it's important information that needs to get out there, so stick around and buckle up. I can tell you hands down, without any question, that building in LA County was one of the worst experiences of my life. The corruption, incompetence, and apathy of the officials, coupled with the severity of how broken the system is in LA, was somewhat unbearable. Now, I thoroughly documented and logged numerous instances where county officials engaged in all sorts of criminal activity: fraud, corruption, extortion, racketeering, criminal trespass, civil rights violations, and more. The lack of professionalism was bad enough, but the criminal activity was honestly kind of mind-boggling. The other thing I want to point out is that the level of mental torture and emotional distress that I endured as a result of dealing with this broken system was pretty severe. During that fiasco, I ended up in the ER with chest pains. We thought I was having a heart attack, and it turns out it was basically all stress related. My heart was fine. I was diagnosed with PTSD, and I hate to say that because I kind of view PTSD as something that like military folks get because they've been to war and they've seen all this horrible stuff. And my experience was, nothing as severe as that, but it was still a pretty brutal experience that left me with nightmares. For about a year and a half, I was having nightmares about the build process. And now, because of the fires and because I'm reminded of what I went through and what other people are going to go through, I've actually started having those nightmares again. And I would wake up, in kind of a sweat, thinking about like, oh my God, I got to do this with the house. I got to do that with the house. And then I realized, oh, that house is gone. I don't even own it. It's sold and whatever. I spent 15 years of my life designing, permitting, and building that home. And in the end, there was so much negativity and negative energy there for me that I decided to sell it. And I ultimately ended up leaving LA County and California as a whole. So why did I wait to bring this up now, and why didn't I ever send this letter before? Well, honestly, it was fear of retribution. County officials have done this to others in the past. People will complain, they'll bring attention to a problem, and then they start to be harassed by county officials. I know a number of people who've reported that they even sued the county and won, and then were still harassed. So I've been harassed enough. I didn't want to deal with it, but I think the story is important enough to tell. For those of you just joining my channel or you're not familiar with who I am, I should give you a little backstory. In 2009, after 2 years of what could only be described as plan check hell with the Calabasas office, and that's an entirely different story that I'll cover in another podcast, I was issued building permits for my house and 2 retaining walls. The house is a dome-shaped underground house that is virtually indestructible, and it was the first of its kind ever permitted in LA County's jurisdiction. I'll have a picture attached here so you can see what it looked like finished. And just a little more history about me is in 2000, I permitted and built the very first dome-shaped underground house in Los Angeles City, and that was in the Chatsworth area. What's interesting about the Chatsworth home was that 2 weeks after I finished burying it, A wildfire tore through the area, and I had 50-foot high flames 10 to 15 feet from the structure on 3 sides of the property. And the fire department didn't put a drop of water on my property because they didn't have to. Because the house was buried, it was protected from the fire, and they actually spent their time dousing the houses on either side of me to keep them from going up. These dome-shaped underground houses are highly resistant to fires, earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes. They even had one that had a giant boulder that came rolling down a hill that was above it and bounce off of the structure and not damage it. And it was the only structure that in the 1970s survived the equivalent of a 1.5 megaton blast at White Sands Missile Base. Apparently the Department of Defense was doing a simulated nuclear explosion where they detonated a hydrogen gas bomb that was the equivalent of a 1.5 megaton nuclear explosion. Formworks was invited to this, and they built a 3-inch thick dome, bulldozed a thin layer of dirt up and over the top of it, and when the explosion went off, 6-foot thick flat-walled concrete structures were completely obliterated like a freight train had gone through them, and the dome was the only thing left standing. And the sensors inside the dome indicated that if anybody had been in the dome, they would have survived the blast. So these are the kind of houses that you can build once and pretty much not have to worry about. It doesn't mean that you can't lose the house in a certain disaster like a fire. You still need to do brush clearance. You still need to make sure the fire doesn't get into the house. But because the house is buried, you have much less of an area that needs to be protected. In a regular house, you've got 4 sides and a roof you've got to worry about. With these houses, because they're buried, really it's only the exposed face that you need to worry about on the house of protecting. And as long as you keep the burnables away from that and you don't allow flame or embers to get into the house, they fare very well. And they've been through real world scenarios of fires and hurricanes and tornadoes, and they have survived unscathed. The engineers have told me that these structures, at least the concrete dome portion, should be standing 2,000 years from now. The houses also have the added benefit of about an 80 to 90% reduction in heating and cooling costs, about a 90% reduction in annual maintenance. To illustrate how strong these are, here's a picture of the Topanga house with over 80,000 pounds worth of heavy equipment parked on top of it. And that 80,000 pounds does not include the weight of the actual dirt. I don't know how many tons that would be, but I'm sure it adds tens of tons more. This particular dome is less than 5 inches thick and yet had 40 tons of machinery parked on top of it. Under normal conditions outside of LA County, the cost to build one of these homes should be similar to that of a conventional home. Now, getting back to my Chatsworth home, that house was designated as a severe high fire hazard zone that the insurance companies didn't even want to insure in. With a little bit of pushing from my broker, he got them to finally agree to do an inspection, and shortly after doing the inspection, they issued a policy. I was paying $780 a year for a full-blown insurance policy, including fire and liability and everything else, and my neighbors who had conventional homes were paying over $4,000 a year for a fire policy through Cal Fire because their insurance companies wouldn't insure them. So these homes address every single problem LA County officials claim to be concerned about: sustainability, wildfire protection, energy savings, reduction in waste and greenhouse gases, affordability, and more. Yet LA County officials did, and currently still do, pretty much everything they can to deter any type of construction that they deem different. And to be truthful, they deter regular construction as well. In 2019, about 10 years after I'd gotten my permit, the head of one of the building departments contacted me because they had 3 of these types of structures in their permitting office, and they wanted to come out and kind of see one as it was being built, and they had a bunch of questions. So I happily gave them my time. They came out for about 2 hours, and I kind of went through stuff. Now, the part that was a little alarming is that the officials had a lot of questions that kind of indicated they didn't understand some pretty simple basic concepts, oftentimes which should have been common sense. And I was literally having to educate them on the structure. And the thing is, I have no architectural degree or engineering degree whatsoever. And yet I was having to explain to them how the structure worked. I was told by Formworks, the designer of these homes, that after a lengthy battle where the plan checker refused to listen to the architects and engineers, and demanded excessive and unnecessary changes to the plans that one of those homes was approved in 2020. One of the officials who was at my house later decided 6 months after he had approved that first house to call up the owner and tell him to cease work because he felt that there was something he missed. And then, unfortunately, that official refused to listen to the recommendations of the architect and engineer over what he was demanding, which they determined was completely unnecessary, and ended up, they had to come up with some other solution. And this is a whole nother story that I'll go into in another podcast. But once again, it showed that county officials were basically, willy-nilly, freely doing whatever they wanted. My understanding from other county officials is that once a plan is issued, they can't come back and tell somebody to stop building. So back to my project. Due to life getting into the way like it normally does, it took me a number of years to finish the excavation of the hillside before I then got around to starting to do the actual construction of the property. During that entire time, I made absolutely sure I adhered to the code. I was adamant about not letting my permits lapse, and that all the paperwork was done properly. There were stormwater prevention plans and other stuff that had to be filed, and I did all of that on time. And in spite of doing everything correctly, I was relentlessly harassed by certain officials who repeatedly engaged in acts of fraud and who blatantly lied about a number of things, including the code itself. I documented every incident thoroughly. However, it's basically a book, and it's a book that I'm going to be releasing in the very near future. Hundreds of pages of story after story of issues I had with LA County where officials didn't understand their codes, refused to do their jobs, and basically lied about all sorts of things. Officials basically lied about the codes, they lied about the existence of permits, they lied about paperwork, they lied about fees I owed. The habit of lying to the public is kind of rampant through these agencies, and the more incompetent or lazy someone is, the more they lie to cover it up. Worse than that, though, was the incompetence. And oftentimes, the higher up I went, the worse it got. There were managers who didn't know or understand their own codes. The paperwork, I had records and paperwork that were lost, computer files that somehow disappeared, and multiple and rampant attempts at double and triple billing and overcharging. And this is all stuff that is still going on because I had multiple friends who've gone through the system and they've experienced the same thing. Lastly was the apathy. Few of the people I dealt with cared about trying to help fix the problem that either they created because they didn't know what they were doing or that their department had made a mistake. So then there was the hostility and vindictiveness of some officials who would become angry and defensive when I tried to explain that they were misquoting the code or basing their opinion on an incorrect understanding of my situation. This was also very common. Now, understand, before engaging with officials, I always consulted with my attorney who specialized in construction defects and understood the codes to make sure that my interpretation of the code was correct. And every single time he confirmed, yes, they're quoting it incorrectly, you understand it correctly. But when I tried to point this out to county officials, I was usually met with extreme hostility, sometimes even threats that were both veiled and sometimes just direct. The problems were all reported to management of the appropriate agency, and the complaints were repeatedly ignored. I documented issues with the building department, regional planning, LA County Fire, and the absolute worst offender was the LA County Health Department. If you were to confront these officials about my situation, the answer will always be the same. Oh, he was the problem. Because I heard that was what was being said. And that's always their excuse, and you should pay attention to that answer because it's victim blaming and it's worst, and it reveals something even more appalling. Officials have gotten away with abusing the public for so long that now when someone actually stands up to them, the victim is now the one viewed as being the problem. And another excuse I heard was, well, the uniqueness of that house presented issues. This is complete nonsense. My issues had very little to do with the house design, and even if it did, it doesn't explain why countless people I know who built conventional homes had the exact same issues. The other excuse that came up was COVID, because COVID became the go-to excuse for nearly everything with county officials when that was happening. And let me be clear, most of my problems happened before COVID, but I will say that COVID gave them a great excuse to basically take a year off vacation where they basically did nothing, ignored emails, wouldn't return phone calls, and flat out refused to do their jobs. And what happened was because of COVID, they got used to doing everything by email and they preferred that. So now what they're doing is they're doing everything by email, which has made the system even more problematic because they still don't read their emails. They're still not responding and everything is now taking longer. To be fair, I want to say that there was one official who was absolutely amazing. They knew the codes, they understood what was going on. I was able to sit down and talk with them, and we were able to, kind of discuss issues. We didn't always agree. Sometimes they would explain something to me and said, well, okay, on this thing, I can agree with you on that, but on this thing, we're going to have to do it this way because of X, Y, and Z. And I had positive interactions with a few others, but I'm not going to name any of them because frankly, I think that if I named them, they would probably get harassed by senior officials because they clearly are the exception to what's considered normal and acceptable behavior within these agencies. And the last thing I want to do is cause these good folks problems, but I can say there were a couple who were astonishingly great. I mean, the sad thing is that even the bad ones would complain to me about how messed up the system was. So everybody understood that the system is broken and has problems, but nobody wants to fix it. Let's discuss some of the standout players in my nightmare. My initial inspector behaved like a complete and utter psycho. They were a screaming, ranting, raving lunatic one day, and sometimes actually calm and pleasant the next. And I never knew who I was going to get on any particular day. Majority of the time, I got the psycho. In fairness, I suspect this person probably has some mental health issues. They might be bipolar, maniac, depressive, something else. And I truly hope they get help. At the time, I hated them, and looking back from a slightly different perspective now, I kind of just feel pity on them. I even had contractors at time that told me, who's your inspector? Because they didn't want to give bids if this individual was going to be the inspector in the area. I was also told that at a certain point, there were so many complaints about this individual that they were moved out of the neighborhood and sent to a new area. So that was great for the folks in the Topanga area, not so great for wherever they went to. Complaints were filed to their supervisor about this individual, and they were subsequently ignored. Then there was the management. The manager in the particular office I was dealing with at the time was incompetent, hostile, vindictive, and petty. They engaged in harassment when it was proven that their office had made numerous mistakes, and then they flat out refused to do their job. I was actually made aware that they were trash talking me to others because I did have some people within the system that liked what I was doing. At one point during the septic fiasco, which is a whole nother video, when I told them on the phone that this was likely going to end up in a lawsuit, their response was, go ahead, sue us, it's not my money. Besides, the minute you file a lawsuit, your project will be frozen. Good luck finishing it once that happens. This individual's behavior was anything but managerial, and again, complaints were ignored. Then there was another manager who, to their credit, was actually nice, but completely incompetent. They were lazy. They didn't understand the codes. They couldn't be bothered to read their emails, and when asked to look up a code, refused to do so, and instead made me schedule an inspection to get a very simple answer to a simple question. But to be fair, this particular manager was always polite, so, I can kind of give them credit for that. And I don't fully blame them for their incompetence because in their discussions, they revealed to me that they were originally hired to work in the roads department, and then when they were thrust into managing a building and safety office, he was doing a job that he reluctantly admitted he'd never been trained to do. He did eventually help me on the problem that I had, but it was a nightmare getting them to do it, and they flat out refused to call anyone who would confirm that they were incorrect in their interpretation of the code. Then there was an LA County Fire Department building official who lied to me repeatedly, wasted months of my time regarding a variance I applied for. They never actually read my proposal based on the comments they made to me in emails and refused to answer a single question I posed to them. In the end, after nearly 3 months of wasting my time, they admitted in an email that they weren't qualified to make a determination on that variance anyway. Well, if they weren't qualified to make a determination, then why were they involved in the process to begin with? Emails sent to their supervisors were received and subsequently ignored. The one saving grace was that they forgot to charge me the nearly $500 to do the variance review. This same official refused to provide me information I requested and ignored a Freedom of Information Act request, which is a federal and state law. Then we have the absolute worst offender, the health department. In the health department, I dealt with 4 different managers regarding my septic permits. All of them didn't understand their own codes, and they had no idea what they were doing regarding the issues with my septic permits, which is yet a whole nother podcast. 2 of them were pleasant and always professional, and when I pointed out they were misinterpreting the code and explained what my lawyer and I believed it meant, they both kind of stepped back and said, well, maybe we have this wrong. Let us confer with county counsel. They seemed to want to do the right thing and listen. So again, I want to give credit where credit's due. One of those 2, though, I spoke with many times regarding an issue I had at my other property regarding a meth house that was cooking meth, and there was an RV dumping sewage into a creek that led to LA's water supply. On at least 6 occasions we spoke about this. I was told that somebody will contact me about this issue. Nobody ever did, and eventually I moved and left the area. And to the best of my knowledge, the meth house is still there, the RV is still there, they're still dumping sewage into the creek that leads to LA's water supply. So getting back to my septic issues in Topanga and the health department. Regarding the other 2, one of whom was a senior manager, they were both rude and dismissive from the beginning, and the head person got downright nasty and rude at the end. And this was all over problems created by mistakes that their department had made and by their own lack of understanding of the own codes. My book actually features a couple of chapters devoted directly to this fiasco. So at that time, my septic designer also informed me that he had 3 other completed houses that they couldn't move forward and build the septic systems because nobody in the health department was returning phone calls or responding to emails, and that they were actually looking into filing a class action suit against the health department so they could complete their builds. So during the septic fiasco, I reached out to Supervisor Barger's deputy, who I knew from my time living in another part of LA County. And I told him what was going on and why, and he told me, oh, I knew it was bad, I just had no idea it was this bad. He assured me that they were gonna fix this, that he had someone named Anish that he was going to assign to the issue, and that Anish's job is to fix these types of issues. Anish was included in the 2-month-long email exchange, but never responded, never contacted me in spite of me trying to contact him directly numerous times. And others have told me in a similar experiences that they've been referred to Anish, but have never ever talked to him. So to be honest with you, I'm not sure if this guy even actually exists, because everybody's been told about him, but he's never actually done anything. About a week after I initially contacted the supervisor's deputy, he blew the entire thing off and wouldn't return phone calls, texts, or emails. The guy did pop up at one point weeks later to tell me he was going to refer me to a different supervisor's office, since that's where my problem was in their jurisdiction. But then he never did, and he disappeared for good, which didn't actually surprise me, because the guy was always kind of a liar and he was shifty, and we saw him in a lot of our neighborhood meetings where he would pretty much, it appeared that his job was to basically placate the public, tell them what they want to hear, and the county would continue to do what they want. Eventually, after 2 months of endless battles, the issue with the health department was resolved, but it popped up again a month later when a different health department official got involved, because that official didn't understand the code either. And when I tried to explain to that guy what the code meant, he got ticked off and hung up. And the problem was, nobody had updated the records, and nobody had bothered to inform anybody that this is what the code actually meant. I've also had similar dealings with officials regarding other properties I owned. There was another inspector with a different office that many years ago behaved similar to my original inspector in Topanga. This individual lied, was arrogant, hostile, and oftentimes was quoting things that they didn't understand and knew nothing about. So both of these inspectors lied to me repeatedly and often. My understanding is that eventually, when enough complaints get piled up against them, they basically get shifted to a new office, and these people had basically bounced around from office to office. So basically, the Los Angeles County senior officials handle problem employees the same way the Catholic Church handles pedophile priests. Move them to a new location where they can abuse a new set of victims. Think about that for a moment. There was a zoning official in one department that was problematic, and when people would bring up the thought of the underground house as a fire rebuild, his response was, please don't. I don't know why. I don't know if it was because he didn't want to work, because he didn't want to have to think, he didn't want to have to figure out something new, but he did everything he could to deter people from these. He was also caught lying and committing fraud and conspiracy on a number of occasions by lying to people about codes and the existence of permits. Last I heard, this individual had been fired and kicked out of the plan check office, but it took him 10 years to do that. So these aren't the only people I dealt with. There's a long list of more, but these were kind of the standout players in the game. Despite there being a number of very problematic people within the system, I do want to say that a lot of the senior managers that I dealt with had secretaries and assistants and people who answered their phones that were incredibly kind and compassionate, decent people. And when I asked them how often they got calls or heard stories like mine, the answer was usually a loud sigh followed by all the time, far too often, I'm afraid to comment, or I can't comment. And clearly they can see the problem that their bosses ignore. One person actually broke down and began sobbing uncontrollably when they heard my story. And she said to me, I hear this all the time. It's so frustrating. I hate this. I absolutely hate this. And I ended up spending about 10 minutes consoling her on the phone. Working for LA County breaks compassionate people who care about helping the public. Think about that for a moment. This system is beyond broken. And I don't know a single person in LA County who has built anything and has said that they had a positive experience. There hasn't been a fire in LA County where I haven't known somebody who's been through this. I know scores of people who've lost their homes in past fires and now this new one, and every single one of them reported dealing with the same type of issues I did, and it didn't matter which LA County office they were going to. When I posted some of my stories on social media, I was flooded with messages from others who went through the exact same stuff. Even strangers who had seen my post that had been shared had reached out to tell me their stories. So these problems are rampant throughout the system. And in speaking with some of the good people that work there, I was told it's even worse than you think, and I hope you sue the crap out of them. They told me how there's no protocols on anything, nothing is organized, no one has a clue what they're doing. People are hired, but there's no formal training. They don't even have a standardized filing system. Every employee had a different way of filing and doing their job, which they had to make up on their own due to a lack of protocols or guidance. And worse, every single office does things differently, and there's no consistency throughout the system. Management apparently doesn't care and is openly hostile to anyone who complains or tries to fix things. And if you try to do anything to improve the system, then you are harassed until basically you are pushed out of the system. And that's just the beginning, and it gets worse. According to multiple sources, certain officials will openly laugh and talk about screwing over members of the public that they decide they don't like. They'll trash talk their own people, and they'll attempt to get others, including other departments, against an individual they don't like. I know my name was tossed around a lot because a few officials let it slip, but even worse than that was hearing stories about how some officials would show up, throw their feet up on a desk, refuse to work, and confronted would say things like, I'm just here for the paycheck. The entire system of LA County government is completely out of control because this type of nonsense goes on in every department. It's not just the building departments. I've documented these issues with the Parks Department, Animal Control, LA County Fire, LA County Sheriff's Department, and others. The reality is many of these departments are run like drunken frat houses with no discipline, little guidance, no oversight, and complaints are completely ignored. And it's a free-for-all because management does absolutely nothing when complaints are filed. Formworks Company, the company that designs and sells the underground dome house kits, like the one I used for my two homes, said they won't do any more builds in LA County. Now, they have designed, engineered, and sold over 1,500 homes across the U.S. since the 1970s. It's a small company. They've dealt with building agencies all over the U.S. in almost every state, and they have said that hands down, LA County is the absolute worst they've ever seen by leaps and bounds. No other jurisdiction comes even close. They've never seen problems like they see in LA County, and the amount of work to permit a house isn't worth it to them. So a company that sells a product that addresses the problems that officials claim to be concerned with won't do business in LA County anymore. These dome homes also made hillside properties that were not cost effective to build a conventional home on actually profitable to be developed. And they're the only company in the US doing these types of homes. So LA County in its brilliance chased off a company that could have generated millions of dollars in permitting fees and subsequent taxes for the county. The thing is, I'm positive that county officials don't care, and here's why. In 2009, I wrote a long, detailed letter to the head of every department detailing what I went through in the plan check process. I detailed what was wrong with the process, how it could be fixed, why it needed to be. The letter was over a dozen pages long. I gave examples of specific policy issues. Some of the stuff was actually a simple fix. It was a slight change of policy, and others it was obviously more complicated. And I even volunteered to sit down with officials to help them fix those issues. 48 hours after I mailed that letter, I got a call from the manager of the main office I had gone through and at the time, and they thanked me for the letter, told me they just had a huge meeting. They had department heads from every department there, and everybody agreed that, what I was saying in the letter was right and that they were going to work on these things. That was in 2009, 16 years ago. Any wild guesses on how many of those things have been fixed? Not one. Every single one of those problems still exists, including the simple stuff. The reality is, LA County senior officials don't care about fixing the problem system. Let's get into permitting costs. The cost of an average permit to build a home in the US is between $500 and $2,500. And some cities go as high as $5,000 to $7,000. Now you can Google this. The info is easy to find. I spent over $70,000 in permit fees to all the various agencies to build in LA County. $70,000 in permit fees. My overall build cost was increased by well over $600,000 due to county codes and requirements, which ironically are found nowhere else in the US, not even in LA City, where I had previously built. Had I built my house anywhere but LA County, I would have easily saved well over $500,000. What I paid in fees alone, I could have built an entire house in most parts of the US. My Chatsworth house, which was a larger and more complicated build, but was in LA City, actually cost $500,000 less than the Topanga build because the difference between city and county code requirements. So let's get into code requirements and why they exist. They have nothing to do with safety. Most of these codes are designed for one thing and one thing only. It's to generate revenue and to justify the excessive fees, which in turn support this criminal and insidious system. The system is designed to bleed the public out of as much money as it can and at every opportunity it can. Officials were far too eager to find any excuse to charge more fees, and people who question it are often harassed or threatened by citizens that if they continue to fight them, they'll enact more fees and restrictions. That was actually said to me. Oftentimes, no one could even tell me what the fee was for, just that I needed to pay it. And every single agency involved in building in LA County is set up this way, and I can prove it with numerous examples and countless emails documenting the behavior. All of this is in my book, which I've titled Insanity: Building the First Dome-Shaped Underground House, Fighting Corruption, Incompetence, and Apathy Within LA County Building Bureaucracy. Yeah, it's a long title. I'm also looking at shortening it. The other idea I came up with was Los Angeles is dying and the government is killing it. But regardless, I will swear on a stack of Bibles to the accuracy of everything I'm saying in my book and here on my podcast. These problems are rampant. Management has fostered a culture that allows the officials to abuse the public. This isn't going to get fixed until there is a major change and major shift. I personally believe that what needs to happen is the feds need to come in, investigate these agencies, shut them down, and revamp them. Or what needs to happen is that LA County needs to be shut down, their entire system needs to be thrown out, and they need to rebuild it following LA City's guidelines. LA City did have problems, and I'll get into some of the problems I had with LA City in a separate podcast, but overall, their system was much better in many designs, and that was because in LA City, everybody working in the various departments are working for the same agency and the same boss. In LA County, each of the agencies is a separate entity. So you have the building department, which basically handles the plan check and the inspectors. the health department, which handles your septic system, the zoning department. There were countless other departments. LA County Fire has 3 separate departments. One is the building plan check department, the other is the sprinkler unit department, and the third was the landscape plan department. Because each of the smaller offices have a rep from all of these different agencies, the problem is that those reps don't have a boss or any oversight in the smaller offices. Their bosses work at the main office in downtown LA. So they're basically working without any supervision. If somebody from LA County is watching this, all I can say to you is I'm begging you to fix this, because nobody deserves to go through losing their home and being a victim of a fire only to then end up being a victim of the very system that's supposed to be helping them rebuild. And I've listened to like Catherine Barger talking about how she's gonna cut the red tape and we're gonna make the permitting process streamlined. And here's the thing. I heard this before after the Creek Fire in 2017, literally the exact same speech, and they did nothing. The politicians came out, they talked about how they were gonna cut the red tape and streamline it and help everybody, and not a single thing changed. It still took 2 to 3 years to get a permit. It still caused all kinds of problems for people. There was no expediting. They claim that they're going to expedite and get permit rebuilds in faster. They don't. It's all lies. It's all politicians trying to basically cover their asses. The system is probably going to end up continuing to spiral out of control. And this may ultimately be the thing that destroys LA City and LA County. And I don't know, because I think a lot of people aren't going to rebuild. After the Creek Fire, 17 homes burned down in my neighborhood. I think 2 or 3 have been rebuilt. 2 or 3 are still in permitting plans. And most of them didn't bother to rebuild because they didn't have enough money for the insurance, or with all the new code upgrades, they can't afford to rebuild. Because here's the other problem. When you get fire insurance, they base the value on a rebuild on what the national average is to rebuild. Unfortunately, in Los Angeles County, and to some extent LA City, the cost to rebuild is about double to even triple what it is everywhere else. So if your house that your insurance company out of Texas thinks, oh, that's a $250,000 house to rebuild, that may be what it would cost to build anywhere else, but in LA County, you won't build anything for less than $500,000. So people are getting victimized that way. Another way they're getting victimized simply is this. In California, we have what's known as Prop 13. Prop 13 is something that was put into place that basically when you buy a property, your taxes and your property tax is frozen at the price you paid for the house. Every year they're allowed to kick it up like 1 or 2%. They're allowed to kick up the value of your house 1 or 2%. So your taxes do go up, but they go up in small increments. So lots of people, retired people, people who are elderly, people on a fixed income, who've owned their homes for 30 or 40 years, if their house burns down, when they go to rebuild, the house gets reassessed at its current value. So they may have had a 2,000 square foot house that they were paying $2 or $3 grand a year in property taxes on, and now that exact same house now has a $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 tax bill because the value of those properties has gone up so much. And these people, because of their income, can't afford to pay that kind of a property tax. So a lot of people aren't rebuilding and aren't going to rebuild because of that. This is something that needs to be fixed, and it desperately needs to be fixed sooner than later. And I pray to God that county officials take care of this. Please, if you're watching this, do what you can, improve this system, because people don't need to be victimized by the government. Thank you for watching. There will be more podcasts coming up, and I will be covering more stuff.